Today we have kind of a controversial, maybe not controversial, maybe just misunderstood, I think, concept about teaware and teapots. Specifically, teapots we're going to talk about today. Gaiwans and cups and other things could be encompassed, but today we're going to talk about just teapots. And the idea is the truth behind making the teapots. And there's two main questions we're really going to answer today. The first is your teapot made by one artist? And the second is, does it matter? Welcome to Between the Cracks, the podcast where we take you behind the scenes of what it's like to run and own a teaware company. I'm Dart. Today, I'm here with...
Hello, it's Derek from Wonderful Tea and Tao Teaware. I love it, yeah, because this is a question that we've always had to kind of figure out how we want to respond to, how we want to answer. We
Yep,
want to give the most information, but it's oftentimes it's a complicated truth. And
yep,
then at some point, like making all of these, asterisks and caveats and saying, well, actually this part and this part, it just suddenly becomes a bogged down in information.
yeah, yeah. And after carrying, I mean, it's been literally hundreds of teapots at this point, right? And been to all of the major cities in China, Yixing, Jingdezhen, Chaozhou, Qinzhou, Jianshui, right? We've been to all of them. And more we find that less and less of them are in fact made by one person, which is interesting, right? Like how many of the studios that we have right now, we have 10 or 11 artists making teapots, I think. How many of them are making them themselves only? For sure, two?
I mean, the ironic part of it is like the apprentice pots would be one of the few exceptions where I'm like, I think these are usually made by one apprentice,
Right.
just because like one apprentice is just knocking them all out. I mean, though, however, when we say made by multiple people, one
Mm-hmm.
teapot, that means the spout is made by somebody, the lid is made by somebody, the
Mm-hmm.
handle is made by somebody, it's thrown
Mm-hmm.
by somebody, it's trimmed by somebody else. It's
Yeah.
these pieces are attached by somebody else. It's
So
very rare here, actually.
yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things that we're going to look at or we're going to talk about today. One is some examples of why it's done like this from China, and two, talking about some of the experience with some of our friends who are potters here in America and kind of the difficulty of being a solo creator, a solo potter, in terms of cost and labor and being able to produce enough product for like monthly drops. Like it's more complicated, I think, than people think about. And obviously the appeal of the handmade is one, higher quality, right? Two, but then having a connection and a story. And so I think we see that coming out of marketing in China, in Japan, or even in the US, right? Because if you can put one person's name on it, it feels more personal and that feels more real. Um, but a lot of times it's not 100% accurate.
And so, yeah, I mean, let's give a concrete example here.
Sure.
Let's talk about Zhang Yin Chao,
Yeah.
his Chaozhou teapots, because
Mhm.
these are teapots that I've seen sometimes on sale in even in the West from
Mhm.
like like vendors from China and stuff, and they just say
Mhm.
it's a Zhang Yin handmade teapot, Zhang Yin
Right.
Chao, totally handmade teapot.
Yeah.
But we would say, well, actually, it's from the Zhang Yin studio. It's from Zhang Yin
Yeah.
Chao's studio,
Yeah.
and it's not entirely his work unless it's one
Right.
of these, really nice kettles. He only has one of the pieces that we get from him that we would say is totally handmade by him, and those
Mhm.
are these super thin eggshell kettles. That's the
Yeah.
Zeppelin.
Yeah. And to be fair, this is even new for us figuring out how we want to word it, right? Like you just said, like we would call it like a Zhangyin or like a Zhang Studio pot, and that's still, I don't even know if all of the information on our website is updated to reflect us being able to kind of fully think through and talk through how we want to say what it is in that regard. But yeah, so even him, the kettle, not the teapot, is the only thing that we are 100% sure that he puts his hands on every single part and attaches it himself, because he's the only one who can throw the kettles that thin and do that work basically.
Yeah, it would take somebody else like 3 or 4 times as long with so much more like mistakes for the kettles and stuff like that. He
Yeah.
he can just do it perfectly. And
Yeah.
so what's interesting about that is it's like you have the guy in charge of the studio only doing a single product in that studio, and
Yeah.
everyone else is kind of doing products that he has designed, that
Yeah.
he checks and he quality controls it and he puts his name on it. And so this is,
Yeah.
you don't want to consider it necessarily like it's his name as in he did it, but it's his studio, his brand, his
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah, and I think two things I want to go with that. First is the brand, and then the second is when you see like teapots with people's names attached to them. So the first with the brand, I think it's a really good point because like we've seen, like we really like his curvy style pots, right? And not every single pot that he has coming out of his studio fits this kind of like curvier style. The Sunken Treasure, the Whale Song, the newest Wukong's Gourd, and what do we call it? Stump, stonk, chonk, chonk.
Chunk.
All of those pots kind of feature the same like curves to them. And so we've decided to pick up on part of his brand and associate it with our brand because we feel like, okay, these are all consistent. But even the ones that aren't that style, they still meet his standard to be produced and have his name on them and have his stamp put on the bottom of the teapot. So it's definitely important. And we've definitely seen like, mm, a range of quality with a stamp. And I've talked about previously how stamps don't really mean anything in modern China, just like the stamps on tea cakes don't really mean anything because they're a dime a dozen and you could put it on a completely mold made pot or you could put it on a handmade pot. But somebody who is running their own studio, who's putting out their own product, they're going to want to have quality associated with that and typically a style or an aesthetic too.
Yep. And so that's the example for Zhang Yin Chao's studio is he has not a whole lot of apprentices. And this is, again, another terminology where we're getting between studio and factory, right?
Mm,
Maybe like studio in our mind would be like 10 people or less. And factory could be 10 people and more,
mm,
right? And so think of like the I Ching, like they say factory one, right? Like that is a factory line production there. That is
mm.
not one person doing all of the work. It's different people doing different parts.
Yeah. But with Factory One, they will have one person, one name. So they still associate, right, like individual stamps. But I think that that goes to something to the second part of what I wanted to mention too before is like when you see a teapot that's, let's say the kind of the low end of the handmade spectrum, so like $80 to $100. If you see a teapot that says it's $80 to $100 and handmade and has one artist's name on it and saying it's made by that one person, I, I wouldn't want to call anyone out, I guess, and say that it's not, but we have yet to find, or maybe we just don't have enough guanxi, right? Maybe we don't have the relationship to get a good enough price to do that. But it also just doesn't really make sense with the model of people who are making a living being potters in China, to be selling a teapot that you could resell for that cheap and being one person.
Well, what about this idea extrapolated to the West? Like, do we see a lot of this kind of factory style production in the West? Like, are there groups of people coming together to make a single teapot and sell it? Like,
Yeah.
as far as I know, one person's doing everything in the West.
Yeah. So I think there's the interesting like dynamic of like, in the West, I feel like obviously we're more individualistic culture, right? China is more collaborative in that regard and communal. But like when I talk to Mark, when I talk to Jonathan, when I talk to like other potters that I'm friends with here in the US, um, there's a reluctance to bring someone in for free labor, or there's a reluctance to bring someone in for cheap labor and then also put your name on that pot and then sell it. And I think there's really two ways of looking at it. One is you're marginalizing that person, right, by getting free labor and then selling their pot. But the other is you're giving your service as a teacher for free, right?
Mm.
And the what the student needs to give back then and contribute is a pot to be sold as a studio piece. And I know that Jonathan did a series of classes last year and he's actually doing like a teapot class this year. And if you look, you can totally see the people that took Jonathan's classes. The really like kind of dinky, stringy, like sticks attached as handles, the very constricted spout. Like he has a specific aesthetic. And even people who just took a class for 3 months already design their teapots with his in mind. And same thing with Mark's with his like teardrop spout. So I've talked to both of them about it, but I think they both have this reluctance to like, I don't want to like exploit someone for their labor is kind of I feel like the idea behind it. But also I think that I don't, I don't know if there's a good way to do it. Like, I don't know any of the small potters in the US that are making a living and making, I don't know, a lot of money. So let me give some context. So there are some people like on Instagram who will sell pots that we would say are like mold made. right? There was a master mold made of it, and it was made by that person. And maybe they have 50 molds, and they sell those as handmade. And those pieces they sell for $100, whether it's a mug or whether it's like a matcha bowl or something like that. And those can be made very quickly. So for one person to make the master, to make those molds, and to produce those, you could make several hundred, several $1,000s worth of product in a short period of time. A teapot, there's no way around. It takes a few hours at least to make one teapot. And so when you do the cost of that over the course of a week, a month, it's almost impossible to make even the median income, let's say $40,000 to $45,000 a year. It's almost impossible at selling a teapot for between $200 and $300. It's almost impossible to make a livable wage as a potter making it yourself. So like they have this reluctance and this fear and this worry about it, but at the same time, they can't do more than really make ends meet by trying to make everything themselves. So I think there hasn't been a give for it, but I think that it's coming, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it sounds like it's untenable. Like
Yeah.
who can
100%.
really make a living with pottery? I feel
Not
like
well,
the only ways
not
to
not with
really,
pottery,
yeah.
with teapots.
I was gonna say, like, the only way I could see it is if you open a pottery studio. Like if you are the owner of the pottery studio, of the kilns and stuff like that, and you're renting out your space, you're renting out all of this other stuff. But again, you're
Mm.
not just selling teapots at that point,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you have this like mix of, because teapots are the most complicated functional thing to build, right? Like plates are easier, bowls are easier, vases are easier, cups and mugs are easier because they only take one or two shapes. Whereas a teapot you have the body, you have the lid, you have the spout, you have the handle, and then you have all the proportions and everything matching. So like you could go the route of not making teaware, and that could work. You could go the route of teaching more, but then again, you're not making the pottery. Or like you said, you could own the studio, but even then, talking to friends who like own their own studios, own their own kilns, it's a lot of work just to try and get enough traction of other potters to fill the kilns every time they want to fire it, and the space is expensive, and I don't want to say it's a lose lose, but it's definitely not a win win. Owning a space and renting it out, it almost feels like there's still struggle for both parties, the person who owns the studio and the potters who are like renting the space. If you're making teapots, again, it's kind of a weird niche within pottery studios, but
It this is reminding me of a quote from like Buckminster Fuller where like instead of trying to fix an old system, you create a new model that makes the old one obsolete. And so what inspiration can we draw to design a new model? Let's look at the Chinese side. How is it
yeah,
done? We mentioned
yeah,
not wanting to exploit people and not wanting to like, have them free labor and everything.
yeah.
But there is a very fair trade-off going on with the
yeah.
masters and the apprentices here in China. So let's talk about kind of how it works here.
I don't want to give away too much, but I've actually already been talking to one of my friends who is a potter here and having like a dedicated like almost apprentice, and that would be the free labor version, and then the other version would be like a paid class version, and kind of having the dynamic of both. So do you want to talk maybe about Master Kumin's studio and how that works? Because that's a really cool deal. That like if that was happening in the US, there'd be people lining up to try and get in and like be an apprentice like in a studio like his.
Yeah, I mean, Cummins Studio, Cummins Apprentices, the whole system there, it's like out of a storybook. This is the
Yep.
ideal way to do like a master apprenticeship. So
Yep.
Cummin is the teacher of ceramics at
Hmm.
the Chaozhou University. And
Right.
then he finds students that are really interested in it. If they show aptitude, if they pass like the test and show ability and everything, he offers them an apprenticeship as soon as they graduate. What
Right.
happens is they graduate from university, they live in the studio, they
Hmm.
work in his factory, and then he is their mentor. He teaches them, they create their own projects, he sells their own projects at his studio, and then
Hmm.
eventually, once they get to a certain level or a certain age, again, one other key thing about apprentices is the age. You need
Hmm.
somebody who essentially has not started their life yet, right?
Right.
Hasn't reached that maturity level where it's like they don't
Yeah.
have a family, they don't have kids, they don't have a house.
Yep.
They can live in your studio because this
Hmm.
is they're creating their own self.
Yeah.
And so that's why like the apprentices usually are around like 18 or younger even. And
Hmm.
then it's like by the time they hit 24, 25, 26, they're already moving out into their own studios.
Yeah. Yeah. And that actually goes to so what I was talking about with this this US potter that I don't want to give away too much, but I'm going to give a little more. Um, when I was talking with them about it, mentioning how like if you gave a 16-year-old the opportunity to instead of pay $100 or several $100 a week, a month for classes, to be able to come and learn for free, and the only trade-off is some of your work gets sold back by the studio, what 16-year-old would say no to that? Like somebody who's in high school and wants to do pottery for a profession,
Yeah.
right? Um,
I mean, there's
yeah.
in China, it kind of works as well because there's the Gaokao, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
Gaokao is the test you take as soon as you graduate high school, and that determines if you can go to regular universities or not. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you fail that, like what options do you have? You have technical college, you have skilled
Mm-hmm.
labor and stuff. And
Yeah.
so this kind of apprenticeship really exists really well here for that, where it's just like,
Yeah.
okay, like maybe, you know, sitting down, going to the library is not your thing. Like maybe you want some tactile,
Yeah.
real life experience here.
Yep.
Another cool thing about yeah, like starting young is, these are kids that have been growing up in the studio essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Day in, day out from a very young age when
Yeah.
your mind is still very malleable, very the plasticity is still going on there, and so you can
Sure.
absorb so much information. You're not trying to learn it when you're 30.
Yeah, yeah, and to your point too about the progression of Master Cummins apprentices, I feel like it's cool because we actually have it like in our products, but also
Oh, yeah.
to show like they're the only one of the only potters that we do have that is making the pots completely by themselves. Or no, actually they're both from Chaozhou, right? Wang Peixin and Han Fan are both. So they're
And they're
graduated
both Cummins,
apprentice.
so yeah.
Yeah, they're graduated Kumon apprentices that haven't started taking on their own students yet, right? Or at least haven't started having their students produce work yet. And so there's this really interesting, like, okay, you do the apprentice thing where you have some sort of benefit where like you're going, you're making, you're learning. And like we've even seen it like in the progression of the apprentice pots at Master Kumon Studio, where like, okay, we see the first iteration of a pot, it's not great. And then the next time we buy it the next year, they've improved it because they've been working on that same pot. And so we can see that progression like, okay, they're skilled enough to be making teapots, but they're still learning and still like developing that style. And then we have people like Hong Fan with like the girdle. And then we have Wang Peixin with the two dragon eggs, the tryst. And then he also makes, if you've seen on like Instagram, those ridiculous like three spouted pots. He keeps trying to get us to buy those. We'll probably get some of those. They're in this kind of middle ground before they start taking in students. And so there's almost this progression where like if someone keeps doing it, you will not get their pots. Or like Cummins pots. If we got one of Master Cummins pots, do you know off the top of your head how much one of his pots are right now? Like if someone were to come in like the tea shop and buy it, does he have any of his
It
out?
would be he doesn't have them out. Yeah, again,
Yeah.
it's one of those things you have to know him to buy it, but it would be
Yeah.
several yuan, right? Like
Yeah.
3, 4, 40,000, 50,000 renminbi, right? Which would be close to
So
like
$5,000 to $7,000, right? Somewhere in that range.
yeah,
Because
US
30,
dollars. Yeah.
35,000 would be like $5,000, right? So more than $5,000. So like if you want to
For a
follow
single
the
teapot.
artist, yeah, it's crazy, right? I mean, that's like probably more than my whole collection, right? Like of individual pieces. I mean, I only have like two pots that are over $500. I mean, if not over my whole collection, probably close to a
You
lot
could
of
do a
pots.
fun comparison. One
Yeah,
pot versus this many pots. Yeah, that could be
yeah.
a fun YouTube video.
That could be fun. But it's just interesting that like, there's the expectation here, like we have a very young market. Like you say $100 for a handmade teapot and people are like, wow, that's a lot. Or 180, right? Like is kind of our like second tier or like higher tier right now. The Wang Peixins, the Hong Fans, Zhang Yin Chao studio pots, right? Those are all kind of at that tier. Whereas that's one, first of all, we found out last year that we're coincidentally selling them for the exact same retail price that they're selling for in China, which is cool, right? We
Yeah.
kind of we figured that out and found that out, which is very cool to
Mhm.
see. But then also like that's just the beginning. Like there are pots in Yixing that like you get on you get on WeChat and there are pots that are selling for 20, 30, 40, 50, 70,000 US dollars, right? So then multiply that by 7 for their MMB. Um crazy, right? Crazy. But there's a whole culture around it, right? Like it's not a new market for them. Getting back to the questions from the beginning. Chances that your handmade pot is made by one artist if it's a Chinese pot.
Right. I
five
was gonna say
five
like if
percent,
it's
3%, like right? I mean,
I don't know.
very low.
I would say like it is very low. However, there's this weird it's this like bell curve where it's like if they're a brand new potter, if they're an
Mhm,
apprentice, if they're just starting out,
mhm.
the chances are higher that it's entirely their handmade pot,
Right.
right? But
But
if in
also,
that mid range of like pretty good, like it's probably not handmade, entirely
right.
handmade.
And that's exactly what I was going to say was like if they're just starting off though, it probably means we wouldn't sell it and people probably wouldn't want to buy it, right? Because you're talking about a pot that basically would either be the cost of an expensive an expensive mold.
These
Is that one of
These are the
yours?
pots. Yeah, these are the pots I made, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there's so many things about it that are just off. Like the
Yeah.
spout just is too long. It
Yeah.
doesn't pour right. Like
Yeah.
it's like, okay, I got the no catch lid from Come In. All right,
Which is
did it,
cool. Yeah. Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
cool. But it's like bottom heavy, and this is one of those pots where I entirely made by myself.
Yeah.
However, I would not sell it. I would not.
Yeah.
I don't want to use it. I don't want to give it out to somebody. This is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a test pot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So probably unlikely. If the worse it is, and okay, we should define worse. We should define worse because I think there is a distinct benefit to handmade over mold made or yeah, made in a cast. And typically those come from things that I don't know if it's that they can't be considered, and that's something we're looking on figuring out this year is like, can we give direction with some of the factory made pots to try and fix some of the things that come from understanding the composition like of a teapot. One I think just easy one off the top of my head is the teapot. It should not be the same thickness throughout the whole entire body of the pot. This is actually something that I talked about in the latest YouTube video that I just did with the flat boy, the flat pot that I got from RB Ceramics. Interestingly enough, it's very flat. It's a little bit ridiculous, but the lower the center of gravity, the more grounded a teapot feels, and a lot of times the more comfortable it is. But only if it's slightly heavier on the bottom. Same thing with like a cha wine, like for matcha. If it's slightly grounded, slightly weighted down just a little bit, it actually takes away the feeling of the weight, and the weight doesn't even matter at that point. The balance becomes more important than the weight. But can we get that in a mold from a factory, right? I've never experienced it. I've never gotten a pot that we've gotten from a factory that like considers that factor. Like it's just like, hey, make this a teapot shape. Um, so
I think let's talk about what comes out of factories, right? Like we've talked about different apprentices making different parts of the teapot and then putting them all together. And this is
mhm,
what I saw when I went down to Chinjo and looked at the Nishing teapots. There was I think like six Ais, six old
mm,
ladies, all doing a different part of the teapot. Right.
mhm,
One of them was attaching the handle, another one was cutting out the spouts, another one was doing the burnishing and stuff like that. And they're all
mhm,
chatting, gossiping, really good vibe. And it's like, okay, like this could be considered a factory. This could be considered a studio. However, this is not how it's always done. Sometimes you have places that are doing the mold mades, right? And so a
yeah,
machine, a literal machine. So this is the antithesis of the handmade, machine made. A machine is doing the pressing, the shaping
mhm,
of the body, of the
yeah,
lid, of the
yeah.
handle, of the spout.
I think that's like verbiage, right? That's verbiage and
Mhm.
just getting better at like using the right word for the right situation. So like everything I was just talking about, I was referring to machine made pots, what we would call essential pots on our website or essentials pots
Mhm.
on our website. And the reason that Derek is talking like and using the word factory is when he's there, right? When he visited Jianshui, they called it a factory themselves, even though it was, 8, 10 different people rotating through, working, making things by hand. So yeah, that verbiage is important. And again, I don't know that too many people are paying attention or noticing. But yeah, it is important to make sure that we're clear on the verbiage for yeah what we're talking about when.
Yeah, again, this is where it just gets, the more we try and, be transparent, the more confusing it gets
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, this is a factory that they do everything by hand except for the spouts and the handles. Those are machine mold made, and then they're
Mhm.
attached by in a factory line apprenticeship. So it's like, yeah, it's from this one person, but three people touched it, and then two machines touched it, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Also, in the U.S., there's a lot of people that like will do the same thing for spouts and handles as well, where they'll have them like made in a mold, and then they'll just shape them after that. And again, if that was an individual who is selling that pot by themselves, they would just say handmade. No one's going to say, "Hey, I used a cast to make the spout and the handle." So I think it's definitely something that comes from one people selling pots who aren't making the pots, right? Like if we were making them, you could just say handmade, like I said, with
Mm.
the cast, the people who make the cast moldings themselves on Instagram, and they're selling them. They're just saying, "Hey, this is a handmade piece made by me because I made the master mold, and so it's
Right.
handmade." Um, so yeah, I think it's just a distinction of like who's making it and then who's saying it.
With the mold made teapots and like making the master mold, that gets into the area of intellectual property, right? Where it's like, oh, like this is your art, this is
Mm-hmm.
your piece, and then you're selling prints of it. You're selling, teapots that from this
Yeah,
master mold.
yeah,
However, there's a lot more skill involved still making a teapot from a mold than, making a print of a piece of art. Yeah.
yeah. But I also still don't think that the teapots, whoever's making the masters for most of what we would call our essentials teapots, the mold made, the cast, the factory, or not, well, yeah, fact, they are also factory, but um, machine made pots in China, I don't feel that an artist, either that an artist has made the master or that they spent a lot of time making it. Like I did, like the balance example, like maybe it's being made by an artist, but maybe it's just being made by a business person who's like, hey, this looks good, but doesn't
And
necessarily. That's not the most functional.
And also, I think a lot of the molds are 3D printed these days, right? So maybe they're even not even made in the physical world, but made on a
Sure,
computer, right?
sure. And again, if you don't know what a teapot needs to have, that doesn't mean you can't print a teapot. So without getting too far into the terminology and the terms, the main thing, and I think this is something that goes back to, and I've always said this, is was there intention behind the design of it being made? My sculptural matcha bowl from Andrew, right? As a matcha bowl, functionally, it's not the most functional thing, right? It's not designed to be. And so because he didn't design it to be functional, I'm not going to judge it on what I would normally judge for function, right? I'm going to judge it based on what it is. And I would say the same thing with teapots is like, okay, does it matter if it's handmade or not? Not necessarily, but I'm still going to judge it. And we've actually talked about, because we have to have a different kind of like grading or criteria, right, for the essentials pots versus the handmade pots, right? For the machine made pots versus the handmade pots, because we can't at this point. We don't have control over the molds that are being used. And so we don't get to pick and make those decisions to help refine those shapes. Um, but I think it's still the same thing comes back to it. What was the intentionality? And does the intentionality make sense? One great example, travel sets.
Hmm. Uh, yeah, no, it's like, so I'm on the side of the business where I'm working more closely with those factories. I'm trying to find one of our things is, tea wear for everyone, tea wear for anyone at any level. And in order to meet this, this kind of mission that we have, we do
Which
have
we've been
to
doing
get
bad at.
factory teapots. Yeah, we've been not so good at it.
Yeah.
We've been getting the really nice pots that we really like, and trying to find good factory pots that are, as we say, fit the essentials, that are cheap,
Yep.
affordable, and very, very useful.
Mm-hmm.
This is more difficult than finding a good handmade teapot for,
For
100,
sure.
200 bucks.
For sure.
It takes so much more time, so much more energy, so much more work. And so this is, the ironic part where people are like, "Oh, you're just buying teaware from factories and reselling it." It's like, no, this is way more difficult than going to a nice
Mm-hmm.
studio and buying a handmade teapot,
Yeah.
because travel sets, the instance, we've had so many travel sets, dozens and dozens of travel sets. I test and I'm like, this is crap, and I return.
Mm-hmm.
This is crap, I
Yeah.
return. every time, it feels like. And like we've only
Mhm.
found like one travel set we like, right? And that's the alpha.
The alpha set, yeah. And again, I would still say this falls like outside of the scope of like what we're talking about today, just because outside the scope, my goodness, my business brain's coming out a little bit too much. Outside of what we're talking about today, because it's a gaiwan, and gaiwans don't count because mold made gaiwans very easy to make. Like to make a gaiwan that is like functional exactly how it needs to be for $4 or $10 is not hard. It's not going to be the nicest porcelain in the world, but like it's not hard. And the alpha set is like a step up from that. Like they do actually have a very thin, fine rim, and there was some intentionality like in the thinness of the lid. And again, it's still cast, but it's more thoughtful. But it's the easier of the two between like gaiwans and teapots. But yeah, that's still the only one that we found that we really like. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're made to look nice. They're made to be exciting. Oh, this one looks like an orange. So
Mm-hmm.
cool. This one looks like an asteroid. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I love to buy that. You use it
Yeah.
and it burns your fingerprints
Yeah.
off. You're like,
Yeah.
why would you design it like this?
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much like any of the ones like that you see that have like the wooden knobs or even the clay knobs on the side.
Yeah.
The Dragon Fist is one good example of one that doesn't, right? But again, it was intentionally designed. If you look at the Dragon Fist, if you
Yeah.
see where the handles are above where the body of the pot is. And so because they're above where the body of the pot is, they don't burn your fingers. But all the ones that have the knobs on the side on the body of the pot, when you put the boiling tea water in there, it just gets too hot. And yeah, they look cool, but they'll burn you. Or we've even seen some of them, like the wood, whatever adhesive they use to glue the wood to them. Sometimes it'll get too hot and it'll fall off, which like I don't. That's still strange to me,
Yeah,
but
so finding pieces with that intentionality, and this is one thing that Kerman was really big into. He made sure that all his apprentices drank tea. He was like, "You need a
mm,
kung fu tea practice if you're going to
yeah,
make kung fu teapots. Like if
100%.
you cannot make a good teapot if you're not drinking tea." And I
Yeah,
see this in Jingdezhen when I went to Jingdezhen,
yeah,
seeing so many cool gaiwans, cool teapots, and I look at it and I'm like, this is a functional mess. Like, do you think this is going to actually make tea? Like,
yeah,
I look at the spout, I look at the shape of it, and I'm like, that would be a nightmare to use, but it
yeah,
looks really cool. Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so it goes on both sides, right? The factory and the really nice, like,
hmm yeah,
potters making teapots for the first time or making cool teapots that look nice.
right, right. Which is also one of our goals this year, right? Is to have much more control over. And I think we're not the only ones doing this year. There's another tea vendor who's doing the same thing. Somebody who's we may be chatting with soon on this podcast. Anyway, trying to get more control and have more custom products that are designed intentionally from people who are like practically using them.
And you mean
Yeah,
from factories, right?
yeah, yeah. Specifically from factories, things that are machine made, having more control over the things that are machine made to heighten the experience and make it more worthwhile. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, we can't do a $30 handmade teapot. That's never going to happen. So the second best option is to take the insight from our handmade teapots and bring that to the essentials line, bring that to the machine made line. And we have no idea how that's going to work, but that's like one of our big goals this year, is to do that.
And that's one aspect of this that often gets overlooked, right? Because there's so much drive for, like, we don't want factory teapots. We don't want,
Mm-hmm.
stuff made in a big factory. We want the handmade stuff. But
Yeah,
the reality of the matter is, do you want to pay for the handmade stuff?
yeah,
Like, it's and I get this with tea all the time. And so for the tea, I always make sure that I have several different layers of tea, like, like the really affordable daily drinkers and the really like top shelf stuff, just because I don't want to alienate anyone. I want to make
yeah,
tea available to everyone. And that's our goal with teaware as well. And so we do need to
yeah,
spend more time with factories.
yep, yep,
One thing with tea that as well that I always get into, beyond the price of handmade versus machine made
mm,
tea and teaware,
mm,
there's the is it worth it, right? Like,
yeah,
for tea it's so simple, because for tea I can have a really really good half handmade longjing dragon
mm,
well tea, and then a wholly handmade longjing, and for me they're very very similar in quality, However, one is 2 or 3 times the price of the other.
Mm,
And so I'm like,
mhm.
okay, like, is that really worth that much? Like,
Yeah.
what do you think about teaware, the handmade versus the half handmade, or
Yeah. So
is it worth?
I think of we still have one or two pots that I think would fall into not necessarily. So half hand with teaware is kind of a misnomer, right? It's such a loaded concept and loaded word just because again you could call like the bonbon, you could call that half handmade, where the body of it is still being made in a mold, but the apprentices are still attaching the body, the lid, the spout, and they're still
Finishing.
lining everything in that could be considered handmade, but they're half handmade. But then our Yixing pots, which require more work than a wheel thrown pot, are also considered half handmade. So kind of a loaded term in and of itself. But I think to give the example of the product or types of products that are in the same line of what you might say is half handmade from a tea perspective, I would think of the if you find like a $60 to $90 teapot, something in that range that says it's half handmade, or like the pots that say they're Yixing that people are selling that are in that price point. And I think of a couple pots that we've carried in the past. So the kegger is one of them, and then we still currently have one or two other
The
pots from that same
cauldron.
studio. The cauldrons, yeah, the cauldrons fall into that. They're interesting. Originally, I hated all of them because I like it. To me, it feels like fake. Like, but the I think where I'm at now, I think I've grown more accustomed to them. And honestly, I'd be interested in pursuing more of them as long as people understand. I think I've gotten better. And like, if you look at our descriptions of the last few things we put up on the website, like we've gotten more comfortable with like even talking about like the bonbon, I think is a great example. But I'm waffling about here. These pots that fall in this category, $60 to $90, where people say they're handmade or half handmade, a lot of times coming out of Yixing, sometimes a lot of times they'll still have some flaws though. Like the lids will still move. There'll still be some spillage that you won't see on a fully handmade or higher quality half handmade pot. But the thing that really bothers me is kind of the same thing that I talk about with the machine made pots. Is a lot of times the molds being used for them, they do not consider everything is uniform. The walls of the body are uniform. The walls of the spout are uniform. The thickness of the handle is uniform. The lid and the flange are uniform. And so in that, you get a very utilitarian teapot that's claiming to be handmade. And so it loses almost all of its character. So I would rather have a $30 teapot or a $150 teapot still in general, because I think that pot in the middle, it doesn't have the character, but it looks like it's the thing that does have the character. And so I think it will throw a lot of people off, and they'll say, well, like why would I buy a $130 teapot or $150 teapot? This is handmade and it's 80. It's like, well, you're basically paying more for a machine made pot, not actually getting a handmade pot. So I think I do think for teaware, I would rather have, like I said, a $30 pot or a $40 pot, right, than a $90 pot in most cases.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? I like the way you describe that, where it's like that half handmade, if you will. If they're
Hmm.
still using molds to like
Yep.
do shape the body and stuff like that, but then connecting it all by hand, that's just getting a nice machine made pot, right?
Mhm.
It's getting a
Yeah,
more
yeah,
expensive machine made pot because
right.
what really affects the nature of the pot is that, like you said, like the varying thickness of the teapot.
Hmm.
If you have a teapot that's entirely the same thickness, what does that do for the balance,
Hmm.
right? When you're pouring it,
Yeah.
there's no soul to that.
Which again is I think would be weird, and probably it's not the answer that people want to hear, because you can find those $60 to $90 pots that, again, some of them they're clay, but they look very cool, right? They're very cool shapes. They're very cool, but I would rather a more boring, over $100 pot that the art of the pot, the pot as a functional piece of art has a lot more that it has to offer rather than a cool shape.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of difficult to understand this if you're
Hmm.
not using these teapots. When you really pour from a carefully crafted handmade teapot, immediately it's a eureka moment where you're like, this is
Hmm.
entirely different. Like
Hmm.
it feels like I'm not even pouring it. It feels like it's pouring itself. Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's the
And,
magic moment.
I think there's like the eureka moment is really cool to have, right? It's really cool to have and notice that moment. Um, it really wasn't until I met Mark, right? Sanguine Teapots. If you guys don't know how much I love Mark, here you go. Here's the plug. Go to follow Mark on Instagram. Um, it wasn't until I met Mark that I was able to start connecting physical characteristics of a teapot to what was giving the eureka moments, right? To what was giving those sensations. Because a lot of the information coming out of China, and the easiest example that I have is the one we just talked about on in our meeting on Monday, is the fact that the body of the teapot, the spout, and the handle should all be even, right? That's what you'd hear in China. Why? No, why? That's how it should be, right? Like that's how the teapot should be made. But then when you actually think about it, well, if the spout is higher, it doesn't really do anything and it kind of looks goofy. If the spout is lower, then when you're actually filling the pot, it will pour out, right? Think of like a watering can or a watering kettle, right? Like if you fill it too much, and the spout is lower, it'll start to pour out. The handle, if the handle is too low, then your pot will flip upside down, and that makes it really uncomfortable. And then for most people, if the spout is or if the handle is too high, it just looks weird. Um, so there's a very specific reason for all of those things, but the eureka moment, you don't need to know everything I just said to have that feeling, because the potter, like Kuman said, you have to drink tea. And when you drink tea, you'll figure out these things that, like, okay, sure, we could name, but you don't need to be able to name them. You just need to be able to feel them and feel that character and feel that understanding that the potter knows how to make a pot for making tea.
Yeah, and for me, one of my eureka moments always comes from using the I Ching teapots we get.
Mm,
And for me, I just love picking them up and pouring with them. Like
mm,
that's for me my favorite part is just pouring with that teapot. It just feels good. And it's like
yeah,
that is not even a wholly handmade teapot, right? That
yeah,
is made with like different people attaching different parts, using
yeah,
slight molds and stuff like that. However, it all comes together into this beautiful gestalt. And so we're not saying that it has to be wholly handmade to get this eureka moment, but it has
yeah,
to be well intentioned. It has to be very clearly designed.
yeah. And I think that goes back to the bigger question. Like, does it need to be one person? No. It just needs to be planned. Right. And if it's planned and thought after, that's that's it. Yeah. The Yixing pots are interesting too. And again, everyone wants an Yixing pot, right? And that's just like, or as soon as you get into teapots, right? Not everyone. If you've never if you've never had a teapot before, or never heard about teapots before, right? But once you get into the tea world, and you're like, oh, an Yixing pot. But it's interesting because the reason there's the clay, right? Everyone thinks the clay is magical. I don't. We don't. That's another. We know how we feel on Yixing. We'll talk about that another time. But
Thinks the clay. And anyways,
the one interesting thing, um, scientifically, I guess it's just definitely scientifically, is the way that you make a pot is the opposite of the way that you wheel throw it. Right? When you wheel throw a pot, you are literally pulling the clay apart. Right? When you're making an
mm,
Yixing pot, you're patting it, and you're compacting it. And so one thing that I find really interesting about Yixing pots is they do feel almost cloud-like to hold if it's a good one. Like it feels like a cloud. Even some of the bigger pots, the walls don't necessarily need to be super thin. It's a very weird experience that I've only ever experienced with Yixing pots. And that being said, if you don't have any teapots, don't go buy an Yixing pot because everyone tells you to. Like that is not what I'm trying to get at here. I'm just trying to talk about the distinction with Yixing. It's really interesting because you won't notice or feel that until you felt other pots that are wheel thrown, until you felt other pots that are handmade and have different characteristics, like pots from Chaozhou and Qinzhou and Jianshui. But because of the way they're padded and built, it has a different feel to it when you hold an Yixing pot.
here's the thing. Like I'm thinking of things that are not tea and teaware that are handmade,
Okay.
right? Like things that are in vogue. Okay, I have a friend who's a glass blower, right? And they
Okay.
make really nice like glass vases that are
Cool.
entirely handmade, but they're
Cool.
incredibly more expensive than getting a glass vase that's, machine made.
Sure.
And where is the value in there? The value there is looking at one as an expression of art, and the other as the utilitarian process.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a little different from like teaware, because for
Hmm.
teaware you can use both of those in different ways, right? Where the a really nice handmade teapot necessarily doesn't scream art, right? Like I'm thinking of Wang Pei Shin, where his stuff he makes it so clean, so pristine, so
Hmm.
perfect that people think it's machine made.
It's interesting because China and Chinese pottery wants to be as close to perfect as possible, right? So Wang Peixin, he's doing a very like it's Chinese, like it's a Chinese pot. Like wow, it's so good, it almost looks like it's machine made. But I would say that I think it's not necessarily all handmade pots, but the handmade pots that you or I would care about, because I think there are plenty of like art students who would make a teapot that functionally we would probably never pick up because it doesn't work, but it could be a really good artistic representation. And I think that there people almost have to choose, right? There's a point where people have to choose: are they going to be a gongfu pot maker? And it doesn't need to be gongfu, but typically it ends up being, are they going to be a gongfu teapot maker, or are they going to be an artist who also makes teapots? And are they going to sit on a shelf, or is someone going to use them? So I would challenge and say there probably are, I know there are people who are making pots like with that, but I think you or I probably wouldn't necessarily be following that account or see that person, um,
Yeah.
just from our like our interest. Yeah.
Getting into this idea of like why go for handmade and like really other kind of regions like handmade light bulbs. Like I've heard there are people that make handmade light bulbs. Like
Hmm.
it's probably a lot more expensive than buying a light bulb from the store. And then like
Yeah.
what is the value? What is the weight in there and stuff like that? Like it's just a fascinating world out there when you really get into this. Like, is handmade superior? And a lot of
Mm,
times it's like you can't compare the two, right?
mm,
I think in tea where we're kind of it's so close that we can compare the two. But like the people who are buying handmade light bulbs are different from the people that are buying light bulbs, right?
yeah. Yeah. Well, I think everyone's inclination when you actually it doesn't even matter if you're new or if you're really into something, except for maybe a very small margin of people that will always buy the most expensive because it's the most expensive. I think most people are always trying to get, and we've talked about this before, right? Like the best quality for their expectation, right? And so like say biking, for example. Now obviously there's not actually, let's do cameras. Let's do cameras because Hasselblad makes handmade cameras. So we can talk about those because I actually know prices on those and could compare those. So um right now I have the least expensive camera that I think can do the features that I want it to do. Now, that is still twice the price of the camera that I got when we first started, right? Tao Tiwei, right? It's still twice the price of what I thought was the cheapest camera that could do the functions that I wanted it to do. And the next jump up for camera bodies, this camera body I think is a little over $1,000. The next body that I would get is close to 4,000, right? Which is still not handmade. And then you get into Hasselblads, and I don't even think Hasselblad really makes cinema cameras or video forward cameras. But then you get into like 5, 10, 15, $20,000, right, for a camera. Um, I don't know that I could ever see myself believing that I would need that, right? And even the cinema cameras, like I think when I get that, it'll be because I want it and I want those features, not because I need it. Um, but I think like to the light bulb point, if I don't know who's in the light bulbs. I don't know who the person is that's in the light bulbs, other than people who like handmade everything. I think that
I know
the
Florian Gatsby. Like
does he
do you
have
follow
handmade light
Florian
bulbs?
Gatsby?
Yeah, yeah. Is he into
He
handmade light
probably
bulbs?
I don't know if it's handmade light bulbs or if it's vintage light bulbs, but he's like, this is like
Oh,
a Cold War Soviet light bulb
oh,
from and I'm like, whoa,
interesting.
this is getting deep. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I think to the point of the teapots versus light bulbs, let's just go with that example. Because tea and teaware, they're so closely connected when you're using them, I think it makes sense to kind of like go up the rungs, right? Like it's not hard to be like, okay, I want a $30 pot and then a $50 pot. And then okay, like I want a handmade pot. I'm gonna like get $100 pot. Whereas like the light bulbs, it's like when would the $100 handmade light bulb for me ever be like when does it ever make sense, like when is that ever like the best kind of like value, or when is it providing me something? I don't know. Maybe if you're in the comments and you're into handmade light bulbs, please let me know. But I think that that ultimately is like when you get into something enough that you cross that threshold. I think that's when the handmade becomes important. When you care enough about that
And it
thing
becomes a yeah.
that you can see that
Like
value. Yeah.
I remember finding in a thrift store like this collector's guide to flashlights, and it talked about all the
Okay.
flashlights from like 1950 on, and like
Yeah.
the good value for it. What's the value and what how to recognize it and stuff like that. I'm like, man, like the person buying this book, I'm sure would be really into handmade flashlights or
Yeah.
really into antique flashlights and stuff like that. To him, that or her, that would be a very valuable purchase to buy like a really nice, you know, limited edition flashlight from a long time
Sure.
ago. But I mean, we're the same way with teapots to a certain extent, where it's
Yeah.
like people watching this channel that don't know anything about teapots are like, are you guys real about this? Like, yeah, at some point it becomes worth it in its own sake. And so, like you
Yeah.
said, personally, we probably wouldn't buy that mid range of like $60 to $90 teapots when we know how much better like the wholly handmade or like the more expensive teapots are.
Yeah.
However, so yeah, for us it's worth it, right? But for a lot of people starting out, like yeah, like you said, like don't go off and buy an I Ching teapot, a really expensive I Ching teapot for your first teapot. Like
Yeah.
first explore a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a weird like because I think there, and I see this in things that like okay, teapots. I know more than the average bear. I don't know how much more than the average bear, but I know more than the average bear, right? But this is also our profession and our job, and we sell teapots, and I use more teapots than pretty much anything else in my life. I spend more time thinking about teapots than most other things, right? But everything else, I don't, right? So like cameras and photography and video stuff. I'm really interested in it, but like I don't spend any time, I don't spend enough time, right, to know where the value comes from, right? I watch other people's things on that. Magic. I love playing Magic. We play
Mhm.
every single week. I don't know the most about it though. I can't build amazing decks at every power level. I can't see the interaction. Somebody gives me like I have some friends who they'll make a new Magic deck and they'll hand me the deck and they'll be like, "Oh, let's take a look." You show me a new commander deck with 100 cards in it, and like my brain doesn't like, oh, you're playing this combo, oh, you're doing this thing, oh, you have this thing. Like I don't know enough about it. So I think there's still a value, like there has to be, right? There is. It's a reason that YouTube is so cool and that we like watching other people and things that they're really into. And so I think there's definitely value in our opinions on that. That like, hey, buy the sub $50, sub $60 teapot that doesn't look like it's an I Ching pot. Skip that first $60 to $90, I Ching or like clay pot. Jump into a handmade pot that's slightly over $100 when you're ready, and don't buy a three, five, $700 pot until you have so many that you are fully confident that you're going to appreciate it. It's the same thing with tea. I
Yeah.
still
I was gonna say.
yeah, I only have maybe two or three cakes that are like $200 cakes, and I think they're all from you. I don't think I have a yeah. I don't think like I don't have I don't have I think my most expensive cake from Bitterleaf is maybe $100 or $90, and for Paul same thing, 70, 80, $90. So like of the people that I buy tea from all the time, I still do not mostly venture in pots or in teas that are that expensive because I don't want to. It's not being duped. Like I'm not worried about that it's worth it. I know it's worth it for what it is, but I don't know if I can see that value yet, if I could taste that value yet. So I
Yeah.
don't.
I mean, as a tea vendor, like yeah, like I sell the $3 a gram mother bush from Winsatong, but I don't tell people to buy it. Like
Yeah,
I'm like it's there. This is how much it costs. It's crazy expensive, but it's exceedingly rare,
yeah,
difficult to buy, and it's stuff that yeah, like I treat myself to it.
right.
But I'm not going to be like, oh, you should definitely buy the mother bush, like
Yeah,
100%, because it's like
yeah,
this is your path, this is your journey. Like if you are there, if you know you can appreciate the nuances, because it's totally different, because
mhm,
it's not a whirlwind of flavor. It's this intense body chi. It's this
mm,
you have to experience it in a totally different way, and you have to be well versed really to get the most out of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thing about like tea
Mm.
and maybe teaware. I don't know. Maybe teaware fits in with the tea in this versus. other, I'm just going to go back to cameras, right? Physical products, right? Like you can show me the spec sheet of a camera that costs twice as much as mine and be like, okay, it has these things and this thing, this, we're going to attribute this amount of value, this amount of cost to these other features. Oh, it has a full frame sensor. Okay, that's worth more. It has a medium frame sensor. Okay, that's worth more. Oh, okay, it can shoot in this color codecs and it can do this thing and it can do that thing. And it's like, okay, that we all associate that with more value. With tea, it's very much like, okay, there's tastes and flavors and sensations, and then flavors and tastes go away or are less important, and then the sensation and feeling becomes more important. And it's like, okay, there's almost this transition, and I think it's the same. I think it is similar with teapots too, where
Right.
you're not gonna be able to look at the spec sheet and be like, oh, this is worth more, which is also why I am very reluctant to do tea reviews of expensive teas. Um, because I don't want to dog a tea that I don't understand and I don't have the knowledge or the breath to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why I, don't really push people towards it, because a lot of the reasons you're paying more money for it, the reason it costs more is because of the nuanced differences. And like the
Yeah.
nuanced differences, they're not it's not a very clear like, oh, the spout is, facing
Hmm.
correctly. It's like,
Hmm.
no, like the spout has been specifically designed to,
Yeah.
yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
It gets pretty minuscule.
Yeah.
But I was
Yeah.
thinking about when, like, taking this conversation back to the magic cards, like,
Hmm.
would you buy a handmade magic card? I could sell
Like
you
a
some for
proxy.
like 100. Well, like I'll make you one, hand make it, send it to you, sell it to you for like $100.
I mean, so there's plenty of people who do like altars on like real
Oh,
cards and stuff like that. So like I, I don't know. I think for most things, I don't know if I'm necessarily minimalistic, but utilitarian. Which, if you look at the teapots behind me, you wouldn't think so. But I don't typically like any foils or like modify.
no,
Like I
me
don't like
too.
any of the like borderless or alternate art cards for Magic because for me,
Ah,
like
yeah.
if I had more money, I want more cool cards that I don't have. Like one that I keep thinking about that I keep coming back to, I'm like, I need to buy it is Metalworker. I don't even remember what it does. It's good for artifact decks. But I'm pretty sure it's on the reserve list. I think it's on the reserve list, but it's like $100 card, right?
Yeah.
I have plenty of other cards that I have a let's say a $20 version of that there's $100 fancy version of. I would never want that card over just getting Metalworker, having a different card that allows me to do different things and put different things in. But if it was like my commander, yeah, maybe I could
Mm.
I could see myself like paying for an altar of like a commander. Like I have a goblin deck, a Krenko deck. Um, they didn't make any alternate arts for him for a very long time, and that's one of the only like cards because it's always out, right? You can always see it, and so that's cool. And so his art is
Love
all
it.
terrible. You have like derpy Krenko, and then you have like new Krenko, which is different than OG Krenko that they printed like 7 times. Um, but like, would I pay for an altar of Krenko, like for someone to do? Yeah, 100% would do that because it sits out and has like a cool, like cool story and cool reason for it. But like the rest of the 99 cards in my deck, no, absolutely not. I would never pay for no altars of anything else that like isn't the commander, for example. Or yeah.
And so, I mean, that's cool to bring it back to. I mean, that's a cool way to bring it back to the tea practice, right? Like
Mm.
there are certain things that are your commander in the tea setup, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Things that are
Yeah.
always out, things that are
Yeah.
always going to be used. Like this teacup given to me by Jonathan Steele. Like this is my Juren Bay. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I would spend a lot of money on a teacup like this
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
because it's always going to be on my table.
Yep. Yep. That's wait, we're at over an hour, but maybe we can talk about it a little bit, I guess. It's interesting to see like what are those pieces that are people's like commanders or what they like value or don't value or like what we value or don't value or not value, but maybe are willing to spend more money on. Like it's crazy to me that how many more teapots we sell than anything else, right?
Yeah.
Like regardless of the price, like we have handmade gaiwans that are comparable price or even less, lower price than some of the teapots. But we just sell more teapots, and I don't know if there's something we did. Like I talked to Sohan from West China Tea, and he's like, yeah, we actually sell a lot of gaiwans, and like maybe it's
Oh,
because we use more gaiwans, and I'm like, I don't know, that's a good maybe, um, but like teacups is one that we've kind of talked about where it's like, do we really want $50 teacups where you have like a set of three teacups and that's $150 or whatever, discounted, maybe it's 135 or whatever if they're sold in a trio? Probably not. Or like tea knives. We've tried to like do a few different tea knives. Like, yeah, you know what? Let's just stick with a tea knife that we both like, which, all changes all the time, and we're like, yeah, growing and changing. What are your like I would spend crazy amounts of money on versus like I would spend like nothing, or like just give me the most basic one for like tea ware stuff?
For teaware.
Yeah.
For me, it's all about the jurenbei. It's all about the teacup, which is
Yeah.
it's kind of funny because yeah, like I mean, there's so many different types of teapots guy
Mm.
wants and everything, but the cup for me is just the most versatile, and
Yeah.
it's like I have probably more master cups that are
Mm-hmm.
always out on my table. I think I have like 3 or 4 on my
Mm-hmm.
table at one time, and even if I just have one teapot out, yeah,
Mm-hmm. And what's your like? Just give me the cheapest one.
cheapest one of the master cups I have.
No, 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 no. Like, what's your like teaware thing that you're like, nah, I'm not spending any money on that. That
Oh,
you use. Don't say a tea towel because you
that
don't
I
even
use.
use it. Has to be something you use that you're like, no, I'll just take the cheap one. I don't need a fancy one.
Probably I don't know. I would say the gongdabe, the pour cup, the tea pitcher.
Yeah,
However, like I have the ones that I like, and this
yeah,
one that I like is not expensive, right?
yeah,
Like this is the
yeah,
honeycomb. Like it's
yeah.
it's super affordable and it does
Yeah.
everything I want. I do love the look of like the Yechow's, wood fired like
Hmm.
pour cups pitchers. I love
Hmm.
that. But I know I'm not going to use it because I enjoy seeing the
Yeah, the
tea, the
color of
tea
the tea.
liquor,
Yeah,
the tea soup. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think it's this is where like the nuance of like, okay, well, I would probably agree with you. Like for me, the 10, 15, 20, however many dollar, right? All the glass pour cups, all the glass pitchers, they're cheap, but they're cool. And like half the time I'll use that. However, I do have my cutout for my Pelican case is the one is literally fitted for UHL's pitcher. So anytime I'm on the road, I bring my nice pitcher because it looks good. It's an awesome serving piece. Like even though I can't see the tea in it, that's a lot of times what I'll bring on the road. But that being said, if I had to like give up anything, be like, okay, like, desert island situation, I would probably go back to the glass one. Even though I absolutely love his pitcher that I have, the Crucible. For
Yeah.
most expensive, I think teapot. I don't think I can really do anything else. I think just from like being friends with potters and seeing it's the one thing on the tea table that can have more variance than anything else. And again, if you can explain it to me, it's the one thing that I'm like, okay, you could almost justify anything to me, within the confines of still being functional for me, though, right? Like you can't tell me if I can't fit tea in the top, like if the lid is that small, sorry, like that's not going to happen. Um, but there's so much variance. Like there's so much variance, and there can be so much variance, and I think that makes it like I think I could collect teapots forever,
Yeah.
and never get bored because you just pick up one and it's just like it just completely changes the whole experience.
Yeah. No, I mean we're different in that, but again, like for me, teapots as well is very close, right? Like I love seeing all the new teapots
Yeah,
and just like I'll get a new teapot and it'll be like a new toy.
yeah.
However, the Jurenbei, the cup stays the same, the teapot changes.
See, and that's the funny thing too for me is like I wouldn't say that it's just like I'm just like if I had to pick, it would be the teapot. Um,
Yeah.
I can't keep the same jurembe on my table for more than a couple of days
Oh,
though, because I'm like, oh man, I missed that one. Oh, I missed that one. So like, I still love having like the variance and the variety, for sure, of the jurembes as well. Yeah,
nice.
yeah. Even just the texture like of the wood
Oh
fired
yeah.
versus like the gen shui like feels really nice, or like the hammered stuff, or like the leaf imprint. Like there is so much going on still even with the Juran base.
Well, getting a bit long in the session. I have one last
Yeah.
question.
Okay.
IKEA furniture, handmade or not handmade?
I've never been to IKEA ever anywhere.
Yeah.
Um, my impression is you go like they're like they have the little plug twisty boys, right? And they have the little like dowels, right? That you use to fill everything, and it has like all the letters and numbers to tell you how to put it together. Is that right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
but
you have
but
to put
it's
everything together. It comes in a small box.
but so is it like this is ridiculous. This is I can't believe we're doing this.
Yeah.
But is it the same as like if I were to go to Walmart and get like, like a cabinet that I put together? Obviously, it's going to be made with like lower quality, like particle board material. But is it the same kind of thing where like what is the appeal? Please, like, why do people love IKEA other than like the food court and like the layout? Like, what's and
because
the fancy names?
because it's cheaper than buying like a piece of furniture that's already made, and it's
Okay,
of comparable quality. The only difference is you have
okay,
to assemble it yourself.
okay.
And my question
Um,
here is like, does that assembly by yourself make it a handmade piece of furniture? Does that add value to it?
no,
No.
nope, nope.
Why?
Um, because I have to be a purist for Mark. Because
Oh,
thinking of like my friends who are potters who are struggling, actually making every single piece, every single part, and assembling all of it themselves by hand, versus the person who makes a mold for a mug and sells that mold mug with some fancy, cool color glazed design and sells it for $150 on Instagram when Mark's pots are 180 and he spends 20 times the amount of time making them and has more experience as a potter and could make mugs but doesn't make them on principle. Now again, that's his own choice to do that. Um, but I think I'm just becoming more compassionate towards like the makers of people who are making handmade things. Now, does that mean every single thing in my house is handmade? No, I can't afford to have everything in my house be handmade, but I appreciate it.
for me, I think it's the difference between the IKEA example and like a teapot example. Even if you're doing it the apprentice style, the studio style, where everyone's just attaching different parts to the different teapots, like the IKEA thing, it's all pre-drilled for you. You have the
Hmm.
exact size of screw, you know
Yeah,
exactly where it goes into,
yeah,
and there's very little variation from one person making a piece of IKEA furniture to another person making an IKEA piece of IKEA furniture.
hmm,
However, even in like the thing where somebody is attaching the spout, like they have to look at it, they have to measure it, they have to balance
sure,
it, they have to mark it out with their fingernail, do the holes and everything, and attach it by hand, right?
yeah,
Like you could have a slight variance between like where the spout is attached, and so there's still that higher level of handmade,
sure.
even if it is just attached.
That was a very good answer. It's almost like you had that ready to go. I was mine was a little more aqueous and personal. But no, I mean obviously I think that's totally accurate. Yeah, like the IKEA, yeah, it's like okay, yeah, everything is there for you. Like there's no just because, and this goes back to like, okay, is your piece probably made by hand by one person, even if it has one name on it? If it's less than $300, probably not. But
Yeah,
does it matter? No, because you still have to have an artist put that
yeah.
together, be able to see it. And each of those, let's say you do have four artists. Let's say one makes the body, one makes the lid, one makes the spout, one does the handle. Each of them have to be at a comparable quality to have that pot come out a good pot.
And so
That's
it
all I
it
got.
is it is more of a miracle. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to market it
Anyway,
better than singular. No, I'm just kidding. We're never going to
yeah.
do that.
Mir-
Um,
it'll be our miracle pots. That's
oh
that's our
my
new
goodness.
factory pot name, Miracle Pots. Yeah. Anyways, it's good to be back. Huh?
Yeah. All right. We'll catch you guys next time. Bye.